And in his case, the only thing that stood out in his report, was a red flag for me, was he just shared, and this was jokingly, this was not part of his health report, the intake process, but it was just a side comment, which is his friends kid him because he's known for being able to fall asleep anywhere, anytime. And, even in a conversation, if they're all sitting around, in the evening and there's a lull in the conversation for 30 seconds, he can fall asleep.
Yeah, well, that's a telltale sign right there, right?
Exactly. And that's what I said. It's like I hear that that's funny and it's a joke and it's all of that, but does that mean anything to you?
Yeah.
No, it's just who I am. I work a lot. I don't always get good sleep. I'm a little tired, but whatever. It's no big deal. Well, what we found out.
How good can we be? How do we make 100 the new 30? How do we live well beyond 120? And how do we live young for a lifetime? These are the questions driving our conversations here to help you become an age hacker. On this show, we want to help you optimize your life energy, longevity, health, and human performance with powerful and actionable information. And in this episode, Dr. Gladden has a very impactful conversation about optimizing the nervous system with combat guest Guy Odishaw. Guy is doing some very important work and getting pretty impressive results in terms of solving imbalances in people's autonomic nervous systems, TBIs, chronic depression. And so he's here to share his latest insights with Dr. Gladden and show you a way to optimal regulation. This is a very encouraging conversation about what's possible. So, welcome to the Gladden Longevity Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to this edition of the Gladden Longevity Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeffrey Gladden, and as you know, we're here to answer 4 primary questions. How good can we be? How do we make 100 the new 30? How do we live well beyond 120? And how do we live young for a lifetime? And to that end, we're going to continue to talk about one of the topics that I think is really foundational, quite honestly. In fact, maybe you've heard me say this before, but I really think all of life, in essence, comes down to one thing, and that's optimizing the nervous system. And that has to do with how we think, what we believe to be true about ourselves, about other people, how we respond to challenges that we come into, how we learn, how we move. Almost anything that you can think of comes back to understanding and optimizing the nervous system. And to that end, I'm being joined by a guest that we've had on previously, Guy Odishaw. And Guy works and runs Cerebral Fit in Canada. It's a company that's really focused on helping people optimize brain function, if you will. So, Guy, welcome back to Gladden Longevity Podcast.
Delighted to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. So, before we started here, we were talking a little bit about some clients in terms of looking at their nervous systems in different ways. And I think one of the things that we run into is helping the people balance their autonomic nervous systems, quite honestly. And the autonomic nervous system, for the audience, is really comprised of 2 particular things: the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest, recovery, repair, driven by acetylcholine, kind of calms the system down, basically runs through the vagus nerve and innervates all your internal organs, controls heart rate, etc. And then the sympathetic nervous system, which is basically runs on adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine to some extent, and basically it's more of the gas pedal, if you will, and drives stress throughout the body and the organ systems, and also controls heart rate in terms of elevating it, and also lowering heart rate variability, whereas a parasympathetic will increase heart rate variability. And just to define that for you, heart rate variability is the beat-to-beat variation that occurs with inspiration and expiration. When we inspire, the heart rate tends to increase a little bit. When we expire, it tends to decrease a little bit. And the more exaggerated that response is, the more we can determine that the parasympathetic nervous system is sort of in charge, if you will. The narrower that change is, the more the sympathetic nervous system is in charge. So if you're wearing an Oura ring or a Whoop or a Garmin watch or an Apple Watch or something like that, and your heart rate variability is low, it typically is an indication that your sympathetic nervous system is potentially out of balance with your parasympathetic nervous system. And one of the goals of exercise is to increase parasympathetic tone, but also other things that can impact how your brain works and how your nervous system works can have a big impact, like meditation and other things like that, neurofeedback, brain tap, etc. So anyway, Guy, with that as a little bit of a introduction to the topic, do you want to talk to us for a minute about some things that you've been working with?
Absolutely. So I love everything you said. This can't be emphasized enough. The importance of the nervous system, whether it's central nervous system or autonomic nervous system, it's the information and even we could say intelligence that is keeping the mechanism running optimally.
Mm-hmm.
I love Michael Levin's example of the thermostat in your house, of this tiny little bit of technology, but its intelligence is imperative for a comfortable house to be in, but also an efficient house. And so you think of like a thermostat, we have a set point, and maybe you've got a 2-degree swing. So on a given day, like we're here in Minnesota and we're probably heating up to 90 degrees today, that, I'm not going to have any heat kicking on, but the sun is heating my house. When needed, I want my air conditioning to kick in and keep it in a kind of a homeostatic level around 72 degrees. And so that, that seems easy enough. All of us do it. But if we think about it, if I set that for a bigger set point, so, a 10 degree, so my house would heat up to 80 and then the air conditioning would cool it down to 60. So if I got a plus or minus 10 degree swing, you can just think of, one, that's not very comfortable to be in,
Mm-hmm.
but also the extra work that it's putting on my air conditioner to do all of that cooling. And then if I'm not relying on the sun, if it's on the other side of it, I'm spring, fall, I might have my furnace on board. And if I'm heating to 80 and then cooling to 60, now that's really inefficient. Right? And so we could kind of think about our autonomic nervous system in this same way. We want to have a very small range for our set point. And then we want these two sides, as you explained, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, to be regulating activity within this small set point, and to be doing that based on the demand of our environment. And really, like this is the key. Well, much of the research today is telling us this is the key to longevity, right? As this system breaks down, that's what we call aging. And so go ahead. You got a thought?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so I think that, obviously many things go into aging. There are many, many factors that drive it. I do think that one of the things that does drive it, though, is when the nervous system is out of balance and we have too much stress in the system, if you will. It really takes a big toll on the nervous system. And I just had the opportunity to see a couple of clients here over the last 2 days. And they were kind of really interesting examples of that. I may show you, I think I can share my screen here. What I was going to show you, I know the audience won't be able to see this, but we'll describe it for you. This is a max pulse test that was done that looked at a particular individual. And what we see here is this max pulse basically has two sensors in it, one that basically measures electrical activity and one that measures the pulse waveform. And when we look at the electrical activity, we can break it down into different frequency domains. There's total power, there's very low frequency, and high frequency. And the high frequency correlates to sympathetic nervous system, and the very low and low frequency correlate more to sympathetic nervous system. What you can see in this individual is that he has very, very high power. The brackets here are 1 standard deviation, so he's very, very strong power. We did another test for him, a brain tap test, which is also looking at this, and you can see that his stress index is extremely low, and that his vegetative index is quite high, meaning he has really good overall parasympathetic nervous system tone here. When you look at this spectral diagram, however, the parasympathetic is actually fairly small. He has a lot of sympathetic tone, but he has massive vagal tone, right? His power here is 13,886, which is the upper limit of normal range would be 4,545. So massive, massive vagal tone. He gives him an autonomic nervous system balance here that's normal. Even though he has great power, he can also have very strong sympathetic nervous system tone, and yet still have amazing stress resilience and have very, very low physical stress. But what's driving his high stress here is mental stress, basically, in the sympathetic nervous system. So if you swing back over here, you can see that neurohormonally, he is 100% optimized. He has massive energy resources, both on parasympathetic and sympathetic. He has a psycho-emotional state that's 100% balanced, and he has massively beautiful looking EEG with tons of waveforms in alpha, theta, and beta, a little bit in beta, but no delta to suggest that he's fatigued. And biohormone rhythms are 100% aligned, and he has a biological age that's 25 years younger than his chronological age. So the point is that having really high vagus tone can enable somebody like him not to really realize all the stress that he's under. I found that really fascinating. So we had a really interesting conversation with him around who he is actually as an individual, based on another profile that we did looking at essentially culture index. And the culture index shows that he's actually very much of an entrepreneur. He's very much of a team leader. He's very, very innovative. The rules don't apply for him. He's fairly fast-paced. And yet in his current position at work, he's forced to be a team player. He's forced to slow down and be very patient in what he does. And it does cause some stress, but not significant stress. He has so much nervous system strength that he's able to manage that stress, even though he's not working in the sweet spot. So we had a long conversation about him actually looking at switching his job around to lower the stress that's clearly there, but which he actually tolerates extremely well. And it was a really fascinating conversation. So I was just going to show you that in the things that we do here, we can actually dissect this for people. Here's another guy with normal power, high physical stress, low mental stress. And yet when we look at his brain tap, he's very, very stressed, very high stress index, almost no vegetative stress. He has, again, almost a similar pattern, but much more sympathetic tone. Autonomic nervous system balance is completely trashed. And his neurohormonal index, he's down to 1%. Like, he is so chronically stressed, he can hardly believe it to look at it. And yet when you talk to him, he doesn't notice it.
Sure.
His energy resources are virtually down to nothing, and his psycho-emotional state is 1%. He's so chronically stressed. And as people, we tend to normalize this in a way that we're not even aware of how sick we can be. But this guy basically is really teed up for some, dramatic health consequences, right? So his biological age is 11 years older than his chronological age, and his biorhythms are at 1% in terms of harmonization. So these are two extremes that we saw just in the last 24 hours here. I just thought you'd get a kick out of seeing that. This is the kind of insight that we get at looking at people this way. So,
absolutely. I mean, that you said so much there. Like just that you can pull that kind of information out. You can supply that to the patient so they can have that understanding.
Right.
But more importantly, I mean, there's a certain value in telling the healthy person that they're healthy and showing them.
Yeah.
Right. But obviously much more value in showing the person who maybe suspects they're not doing as well as they could be, but to be able to show them how not well they're doing.
That's right.
I think because again, stress adaptation, we all do it,
Mm-hmm.
and can have maybe a background intuition, but if it doesn't make it into the foreground, we just grind ourselves right to the grave.
We do. We just keep grinding on because we think that's what we're here to do, and we're all, kind of brought up to think that, we think that our hero's journey is actually to carry on in spite of, right? We think that's our hero's journey, right?
Isn't that the big piece of misinformation?
Isn't it?
That we're communicating.
Yeah. When in actual fact, the way I understand it is our hero's journey is actually to become who we're actually here to be, to become unencumbered by all of the stuff that we were originally taught, all the traumas that we're living in reaction to, and actually be freed up to actually step into who we really are meant to be. And in that space, you live a life that's really very stress-free because you're really functioning from your center, so to speak. And I think that has massive implications, not only for your health, but for your ability to make a contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the thing of we don't know what we don't know, and that seems obvious to say. It's different when you're living it. And in the second person's example is of them not knowing how them not knowing the experience of flourishing.
That's right.
Right. What they know is what they know, their day-to-day experience, and they're like, oh, I'm fine with this.
Right.
But in trying to talk with a person like that, you might run into, but everything is fine.
Mm-hmm.
From our side, sometimes it can be, but what if it was finer?
Right.
Yeah. Like just imagine what life might be like if you had more energy and more creativity and it's kind of, it can be challenging to paint that picture for people. And you reminded me of, so we were talking earlier about a particular case and we're happy to talk through that in detail, but you reminded me of another one. And so I had somebody in the clinic and we were doing what we do. So QEG, biofeedback. So we do a 10-channel biofeedback. I loosely call it HRV, but it's much more than that. So we've got them all wired up. We're doing all the intake. And I noticed that his biometrics, and like you're talking about, his sympathetic, parasympathetic is way out of balance. And this is a guy who, he's maybe early 40s, CEO of a company, in great condition, does a lot of athletic events, just as I'm doing this and I'm kind of sharing with him some of the metrics, he's pulling out his phone and he's pulling up all of the health records from all of his executive physicals, showing me that, I've got a perfect heart scan and I've got everything, right? I'm perfectly healthy.
Right.
How can you be telling me that I'm anything but perfectly healthy?
Right. Yeah.
What's wrong with your equipment?
Right. Exactly. It's interesting. It's really interesting because your arteries can look okay. Your VO2 max can be fine. All these things can look good, and yet you're still missing the point. So
exactly. And in his case, his report, the only thing that stood out in his report that caught like as a red flag for me was he just shared, and this was jokingly, this was not part of his health report, the intake process, but it was just a side comment, which is his friends kid him because he's known for being able to fall asleep anywhere, anytime. And, even in a conversation, if they're all sitting around, in the evening and there's a lull in the conversation for 30 seconds, he can fall asleep.
Yeah. Well, that's a telltale sign right there, right?
Exactly. And that's what I said. It's like I hear that that's funny and it's a joke and it's all of that, but does that mean anything to you?
Yeah.
No, it's just who I am. I work a lot. I don't always get good sleep. I'm a little tired, but whatever. It's no big deal. Well, what we found out was, he had this really kind of asymmetric response in his autonomic nervous system where he would he could immediately lose sympathetic tone, like just drop off the chart. And then his on the vagal side, he would drop into a dorsal vagal rather than a ventral vagal. And so we could be doing.
Explain dorsal vagal versus ventral vagal for us.
Sure. So we think of if we think of the kind of the old, fight, flight, freeze kind of thing that leaves out the kind of rest and digest or the recover piece of it, the positive. We think of freeze as dorsal ventral. So it's the feigning death process in our nervous system, right? This ancient legacy. So, what a person can be in high sympathetic drive, or into a rest and digest, or into a freeze state where the systems really kind of more kind of go dormant, rather than are in an optimizing regenerative state. So we have really these three legs to this stool. And fortunately, most people, and most of the time, we just talk about kind of the gas and the brake, and we talk about, sympathetic tone, increasing activity, and parasympathetic, kind of the vagal brake or withdrawing some of that sympathetic activity. That's the most common kind of conversation. And the dorsal ventral doesn't get mentioned that much, but it's in the mix, and we don't usually see it unless it's pretty extreme, activity that brings that in as part of a person's day to day. And his history has that. His narrative has a really extreme TBI in it. And again, we never know in people's histories what brought it about, but it is the most likely place that this happened for him. And it also marked in his health history a turning point. The before and after that accident was dramatic and marked.
So this guy had a TBI. So are you thinking that that's contributing to his ability or need to sort of fall asleep at the drop of a hat? Or do you think that's just related to his lifestyle choices, or how are you weaving that together?
Sure. Yeah. So my best guess is that TBI had an impact on the operation of his autonomic nervous system. And then it changed the signaling away from kind of a neurotypical to an atypical signaling pattern that was no longer driving him in optimal states of arousal and rest and digest. So
when he wasn't sort of stimulated, then the thing would just drop off the map. It was just flatten out completely.
Exactly.
It wasn't like the parasympathetic kicked in and the sympathetic went down. It was never balanced. It just kind of evaporated. Sympathetic evaporated, and so we just kind of fell asleep. That's what you're saying. Yep. Interesting. Okay.
Yep. And so the way this presented in the clinic is we would try and do, either neurofeedback or biofeedback. And the moment he was kind of left on his own, 30 to 60 seconds, poof, just out.
Right.
And, we tried all kinds of things. We have all of our tricks to try and help people, because people come in different states. They're exhausted.
Right.
They're all kinds of, metabolic reserves are down. So we have all of our tricks. None of our tricks worked on him, beyond 5 minutes. Could I keep him awake for 2 minutes? Yes, but then gone. So ultimately, once I got a handle on the pattern, we switched from doing neurofeedback into doing biofeedback, doing again focusing kind of heart rate variability, giving him data on his sympathetic and parasympathetic states. And what I loved about the guys, most of our high achievers, people, they want to do it. Like, I'm going to do it, and so he's already trying to figure out hacks to stay sympathetically innervated, right? So he's doing short, rapid breathing, all of these things, right? And so, I got to talk him out of all of those. It's like, nope, that's not what we're doing. We want to restore the natural intelligence in your autonomic nervous system. I don't want your mind coming up with a strategy to self-manipulate.
Right.
We want to actually talk with your autonomic nervous system.
Bring it back online.
Yeah, bring back that natural intelligence that's in there. So once I disavowed him of all of the habits of like doing it, I will do this. and just let him surrender to kind of the paradigm of operant conditioning. It took a few sessions, but sure enough, we got him to a point, and we're not done yet, where he could stay awake for progressively longer periods of time and made it through a full 45-minute training session without having to slap himself in the face or do anything to stay awake, but just stayed awake.
And so how did you do that, actually? How did you actually bring that back up?
So in this case, we gamified it, and we used heart rate variability, we used heart rate, and we used temperature. So that was another thing. His temperature would be down at 72 degrees, in a room that was 72 degrees, and that should not be the case. That's way too low for a healthy, athletic person to be hanging out.
So his core temperature would drop?
Peripheral temperature.
Peripheral temperature would drop. Okay.
Yes, peripheral temperature would be basically at room temperature.
Wow.
So I'm giving him that data. So he sees on a screen, this little game that he's making this red jewel kind of rise as his metrics optimize. Right now, he has no idea how to do it. I don't want him to know how to do it, because I want his nervous system to figure out how to do it. That's how we access the intelligence of the system.
Right.
So session after session, he's getting this red gem to move up, kind of in this gamified way, kind of to levitate. And the way what he's getting feedback is as his HRV goes up, as his heart rate normalizes, because we needed him more in a zone because he tended to run too high of a heart rate, and as his temperature started to rise. So he's manipulating those biometrics. His brain is, he's not. His brain is manipulating them. He's getting a reward. And what we see is he's able to stay awake for progressively longer periods of time. So maybe all of that took something like 6 sessions. That's pretty fast for somebody to change that.
Yeah. It's pretty interesting, right? Because you're gamifying it. So his cognitive brain is online, right? He's keeping track of the score, so to speak. And yet his cognitive brain is not able to manipulate the autonomic nervous system in this, environment. So it's kind of an interesting interplay between his will to get better and his nervous system getting better on its own, right? There's kind of an interesting interplay there, right?
It is. I mean, it's a fascinating mechanism, right? Because you need attention, you need motivation, but attention and motivation can't do it.
Right.
It's the brain. Most brains they're wired in a way, they have an innate drive to optimize, like to learn, to succeed, to solve a problem, right? Like it's a problem solving organ. And when you present it with a problem, even if it has no context, no history, no anything, like I just say, here's this red gem, make it go up. That's it. That's the problem. How do I do that, guy? I'm not telling you.
Right.
The brain will just set about doing it.
Right.
And its ability to do 14 billion calculations a second, it is just chewing through mountains of combinations and permutations of activity, looking to see a little wiggle, and then that gem like wiggles, and the brain goes, okay, what did I just do? Do more of that, and very quickly, and know this, within the paradigm of neurofeedback, you can watch a brain rewiring itself live in front of you. It's beginning to create new synapses and eventually new neural pathways with reinforcement and biofeedback. Same thing. We can get the cortex down, and firm up and renegotiate its relationship with the brainstem. And
this episode of the Gladden Longevity Podcast is brought to you by the new molecular hydrogen formulas of Chill and Energy.
Yeah, Chill and Energy were a couple of things that I learned about through NES Health. And we discovered that when you combine their infoceutical with hydrogen, you actually get an expanded effect from what you would just using it by itself. So we were very excited to work through the ability to actually infuse, if you will, or imprint the hydrogen tablet with the information related to chill and to energy.
You can hear more about the physics of how this formulation came about if you go to the interview that we did with Harry Massey on episode 191.
You know, when we were trying this in the office, we gave it to some willing clients and also willing staff, and we heard repeatedly how much the chill actually worked for them. If they were kind of anxious or feeling upset about something, if they dropped the hydrogen in the water and let it dissolve and drank it, not only did they get the benefits of hydrogen, which is kind of energizing in a way of making your brain kind of wake back up, but they also felt very calm and relaxed. And so we were very excited to bring it forward. And when we started using H2 Energy and combining those two together, we found a really nice energy boost before we went to go work out or do a mountain bike ride or go for a run or any of these things. And so this is the first two of a family of hydrogen products, I'll say augmented or advanced hydrogen products that we're bringing forward. So these are really the most advanced hydrogen products, I think, on the planet.
I love taking an H2 chill right before I hop in the sauna and an H2 energy either before I do a podcast with you or afterwards because my brain is pretty tired. Get 10% off your order of H2 chill and H2 energy when you use the code podcast10 at GladdenLongevityShop.com. That's podcast10 at checkout when you visit GladdenLongevityShop.com.
Gladden Longevity Molecular H2, chill and energy. It's an upgrade to your hydrogen toolkit.
And
If you're listening to this, what's coming through is that really, you know, we talked about at the beginning that all of life comes down to one thing, which is, you know, how your nervous system is operating and being able to optimize it. When you think about what you're hearing about here is how to reprogram your nervous system, right, back into an optimal state, some of which can be done consciously, some of which is being done sort of unconsciously. There may be an intention associated with it, but you're not consciously doing it. I've found, and maybe you can comment on this, I've found that meditation can have a significant impact on some of the metrics I was showing you earlier on individuals. We've taken people that on the neural check done by BrainTap that we do, that they can look really in rough shape. And I remember a gentleman we had who knew how to meditate, but had stopped meditating. And we showed him what was going on and asked him to start meditating again. And he did it twice a day, faithfully, I think, for just 10 minutes, twice a day. When he came back, he'd gone from being in, like, let's call it the 20th percentile in everything into the 80th percentile in 2 months' time, which is quite remarkable. And of course, we weren't testing him every week or, you know, every 2 weeks to see how quickly he actually got to 80th percentile. But it was pretty remarkable. There again, in meditation, you're not doing anything, and yet your nervous system is reorganizing itself. So again, there's this interesting interplay between wanting to get a result and yet not being able to try to get that result, just allowing the brain to get there. So,
yeah, I'm a lifelong meditator. I've taught meditation for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
I've had thousands of students. I'm a huge fan of meditation.
Yeah.
My challenge, like the place where I will, argue with myself, right? The guy who's in the meditation room teaching students meditation, advocating for its wonders and its miraculous nature. The guy in the clinic, when I'm thinking about specific health conditions, so not the more general commentary that's happening in a meditation state or sense, is the way I think of it is like meditation, telling somebody to meditate. Now, your example, the guy had a history of meditation, so that's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like playing darts in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
You're in a room, you don't know where the dartboard is, you don't know if you're being successful or not successful.
Right.
That's what meditation is like. Like, go sit, close your eyes, meditate. All right. And most people will not do that. And if they try it, they'll come back and go, no, that was terrible. Right. Yeah. And that, I both know there's just a lot going on in there that you don't necessarily want to get quiet and be confronted with, right? And not even talking about like trauma or stress or difficulties. It's just, you just realize like there's a lot going on in there. Like it is not quiet, right?
Yeah.
And so, I just like, my feeling around meditation is, again, love it. When we get to using it clinically, then, there's some guardrails and training wheels and caveats. And I do like where in my meditation courses, I would never say this to my students, but in the clinic, I say it to all of my clients, which is doing some type of neurofeedback based meditation. So that there is some guidance in there, and we can help people, kind of shorten the course for where we want to get them, which is we want to get them into kind of a healthy, happy, positive, life-affirming, health-affirming state. And we want to keep them out of the ruminating, kind of neurotic, that state, which is equally possible to come up when you just say sit and notice your breath.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a good point. I think for me, the analogy is learning to meditate is a little bit like learning to ride a bike, right? You get on it, you keep falling, you keep putting a foot down. It's not working, and then you feel it for a second. It's like, oh, I just felt that for a second, like that little bit of glide, right? Yeah. And then the next thing you know, a pedal comes down and it's a little more glide, and then you crash again and whatever. So if you're learning to meditate, I think it's a little bit like just being patient, realizing that it's going to take a little bit before you find that space where you don't really have a thought and you just really feel at peace and you just really feel completely connected to everything that is. And it takes a little bit to get there. So there are lots of different tools to do that, different guided meditations. BrainTap itself makes a headset that has some photomodulation in the ears and the eyes, and you can dial yourself into different brain frequencies like alpha, theta, gamma, delta, whatever you want. But the point is that having some assistance in getting there is really worthwhile on the meditation front, because the benefits of it are off the charts. They're just off the charts with regards to health. So if you're hearing this and it's like, well, I'm not really interested in doing that. I don't think it's really for me. I don't think I can do that. Every time I've tried it, I've failed. Don't give up on it. You really want to ride that bike. That bike will take you places. That bike will, like for a 8-year-old kid on a bike, that's freedom. Meditation for you as an adult is freedom, right? And you really want that. That being said, there are other tools too, like what Guy's talking about with neurofeedback and biofeedback and other things too, transcranial magnetic stimulation and other things that can be done, right, to help put the brain back into a more optimal state. So,
yeah, I just want to echo your words. I agree. I think what meditation offers, the fruits of the labor are absolutely worth the labor.
Yeah.
But I'm just one who always likes to talk about, like, there's labor. It's difficult, right?
That's right.
As my teacher, traditional Zen teacher, said, it's boring and frustrating.
You
got to get through that, right? And then when you do, you're like, oh, this is why. And so, my advocacy is like anything. If you want to learn to play the piano, you probably want to get a piano teacher.
That's right.
Right. And
it takes a minute. That's right.
Yeah. If you want to learn how to, turn wood on a lathe, right? Like take some classes on that. It's helpful. Right. Like there's a reason. And so, so meditation has the appearance of being so easy. I don't need any equipment. I just have to close my eyes and focus on my breath or whatever. Yeah. And then what those of us who have done it know is like, it's not like that.
Yeah, no, it does. I think that's a great point. It does take some coaching. It does take some patience on your part. It's understand that you're learning a new skill, even though it's ostensibly very easy and a lack of doing. It is definitely a skill, and it takes a bit to get there. So, yeah.
Yep, absolutely worth it. So what's your sense of we could jump into that other case that I had.
Yeah. Why don't you talk about that other case that you brought up initially? That'd be good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do a version of what you did. I'm going to throw something up on the screen. We'll describe it for the listening audience, but should anybody see the video of this, they'll be able to see that. I will just pull that up. So and what we're seeing here, again, to see the scene, is we have somebody doing 19-channel neurofeedback. They're flying a plane with their brain. And in this case, I'm doing as I always do in the clinic when we're doing neurofeedback. We're also doing 10-channel biofeedback. So we're monitoring the biometrics at the same time we're monitoring the EEG. In this setup, we're actually training the on neurofeedback and just monitoring on biofeedback. So this person, a little bit of their story is...
Let me just interrupt you for a quick sec. So just so people can get a visual of this. So there's a woman sitting in a chair with a cap on, and the cap has EEG leads attached to her head. She's looking at a TV monitor ahead of her, and on the monitor is an airplane that's flying, and she's putting her brain into a place of concentration, just kind of a place of it's almost a meditative state to some extent, but kind of putting her brain into that space that enables the plane to keep elevated and keep flying over different obstacles and things like that as they come along. And then behind her are a number of screens that have her full-blown EEG and some other biometrics, and that's kind of what we're talking about. So, yeah.
Yep, great. Thank you for that. So again, in her case, we 55-year-old woman, 30 years of chronic depression, has done therapy, has done medications, all at scale, has tried every intervention. Eventually, we came up on her list of things to try. And I will say, much to her credit, is as little success she's had at escaping this chronic depression, she has continued to try. And that is, is obviously, that's the most important thing for people who haven't yet been successful, is that they don't give up hope.
God bless her, right? I mean, that's a difficult road to go down. So.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. And so she came in. We presumed neurofeedback and neurostimulation for chronic depression. That was the workup. That's the path we headed down. We weren't seeing the kind of results that our clinical findings would typically tell us we should see. We should see more change over the series of sessions she was having. That led us to kind of go back, reinvestigate her case, and then kind of come back in with some different approaches. And that was adding in the biofeedback to see what her autonomic nervous system was up, because maybe the problem wasn't living in her central nervous system, but was living in her autonomics. And sure enough, that's what we found. And so that's kind of what we're seeing here. So here on the screen, what we're seeing is kind of heart rate variability, which is very high, coherence, which is okay. Temperature turned out to be low on a pretty regular basis. Skin conductivity should be stable. Peripheral circulation, hers is extremely low. Then we're seeing a spectral display. So we have the very low, and high frequency of her heart rate variability. So one of the things that caught my attention right away was her heart rate variability is much too high for her demographic. And so as I looked into it, we see that her heart is beating, that it isn't being well paced by her system. And so as we talked about earlier, this is one of those things that is a factor that leads to poor health. And statistically, we would even say, suboptimal longevity is because her system isn't being regulated to a homeostatic state. Her heart beating tends to be way too fast and is changing gears far too often for what the environmental demand is. Her heart doesn't need to be working that hard.
Well, you'd expect her, to your point, if she was just sitting in that chair, maybe her heart rate would run at 65 or 70 or something like that, being there with a cap on and all that.
Yep.
But instead, you were seeing it jump up to 95 or close to 100 and then back down to 60. And so the the variation in what was happening was just, sort of inappropriate, if you will, to the context in which she found herself, right?
Correct.
So, yeah.
Correct. And then, and so now we're looking at data here that is from 4 sessions in, and what we see is her heart rate variability has now normalized. And, yes, we could say objectively it's low on a health index, like this is a low, but it's accurate now. Her heart is beginning to be paced, and that's the main thing for her we needed to restore was first get her heart reconnected, so it's being paced. Then we can start training her heart rate variability to move, to a more optimum state. But we couldn't do that when it was off running on its own.
So this is an interesting point. So we tend to think of high heart rate variability as being a good thing and low heart rate variability as being a bad thing, because high heart rate variability typically is associated with high parasympathetic nervous system tone, and low heart rate variabilities associated with high sympathetic nervous system tone or more stress.
Correct.
But in this case, she had high heart rate variability, not because she had a lot of parasympathetic nervous system tone, but because the heart rate was just kind of unhinged from what was going on with her respiratory rate. And so it was indicative of another problem. So, everybody's used to looking at their Whoop and Oura Ring and Garmin and Apple Watch and see what their heart rate variability is. And some people will say, well, mine's, really high. And it's like, one of the first things we have to question is it appropriately high, right? Not just, oh, that's great, congratulations, because it could be great, but maybe it's inappropriately high.
Right.
So it's kind of looking under the hood a little further.
Exactly. And that's exactly what happened in her case. Whenever we would mention autonomics, she'd be like, oh, I've got my wearable, I'll leave the name out. And, it says my HRV is really high and my recovery is good. And then when we looked at it, with clinic level equipment where we could break the components out, we saw this finding. And that was what ultimately led to a treatment plan that was successful and allowed her to break free of her chronic depression.
Well, it was interesting. When we were talking about this before, you kind of started treating her initially for her depression, right? Which is what she presented with. And she'd been treated for, I don't know how many different years. But to your credit, I think when you started to see this disconnect between her heart rate and heart rate variability, that didn't really correlate with depression either, so to speak. And it raised the question in your mind, I think, of did she have a traumatic brain injury? Was there something in the past that we didn't know about?
Correct.
So,
yes. Yep. So the finding in her EEG that had some markers of TBI, although in her health report she denied any TBI. So we set the TBI findings aside. That's not uncommon for the report to show some metrics and the person not to have a history, and we set it aside. But in her case, all of those factors coming together, she's not moving in a typical fashion given the treatment. We look at her autonomics. Her autonomics are off in a way that you might make you think TBI. That revisited the TBI metric that said there was a TBI. Eventually, she brought forward the story of when she was 13 and fell on the ice and cracked her head open. But, today we could all kind of go, yeah, that's probably a TBI. That counts.
Oh, yeah,
but at the time, it was a Band-Aid and some ice cream and away you go. Right. So there was no treatment. It went on. But it also marked the point for her of this transition. And we know from TBIs, one of the very common things that's impacted is the autonomic nervous system. But along with that, I think they can be separated, but they often go together, which is the endocrine system.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a TBI and it knocks your endocrine system off, it knocks your autonomic nervous system off. You're kind of set up for a version of what her next 30 years look like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those two systems are interrelated also.
Exactly. And so, like trying to parse, was it a endocrine issue or was it a autonomic nervous system issue, as if it could be siloed? They're interrelated. And so academic to pull it apart. But her health history indicates, problems in both.
Yeah.
And so training her in biofeedback in getting her autonomic nervous system to recalibrate and bringing in the coordination of her cardiac rhythm, her respiratory rhythm, and her baroreflex. So getting those three metrics to kind of line up and then train that. And, I kind of laugh at these. So after one of the sessions, she said, I had this really weird experience. And she starts to describe the experience. It was like this. And she's kind of concerned, not overly concerned. She's not a dramatic person, but kind of framing it in a, like, is something wrong? And, and I just smiled. I said, what you're describing is the feeling of relaxation.
There you go.
And
there you go.
he just never encountered it before. Right. And
that chronic sort of, stress. Yeah, I get it.
Chronic stress, chronic hypervigilance, and encountering, just flirting with a state of regulation and at ease was foreign. Like and so, and we see this, I'm sure you see it too, is people, again, it's that they don't know what they don't know.
Right.
And if people have never been, or it's been so long since they have been regulated.
That's right.
It's like foreign territory.
Yeah. And we tend to normalize, right? We tend to normalize whatever is. If you live with it long enough, it's like this becomes the new baseline. You see that also when people improve. It's like they start off here, then they improve a lot, and they come back and say, oh my gosh, I'm so much better. And 6 months later, nothing's ever changed, right? Because they've normalized the new baseline. So that it worked kind of both ways. I think one of the interesting things, though, was when you switched up your protocol to stop treating her for depression and you started treating her for TBI. I mean, I think that was kind of the genius move here, quite honestly, to recognize that what you were doing wasn't working and then to say, okay, what are we missing? And then to switch up the protocol, still using the same equipment and the same techniques, if you will, but with different targets and different metrics to actually train the brain a different way based on now we're treating TBI, now we're treating traumatic brain injury, right, as opposed to depression. Yeah.
Correct. Yes. And when a person is using, we're doing S-Loretta neurofeedback that really allows us to train kind of like what's called volumetrically. So in other words, we can train the brain, in 3 dimensions, not just surface. Most neurofeedback is surface neurofeedback, training a patch of cortex. And it's great. Not to speak against that, it has its place for sure. But the advancement in equipment and software has allowed us now, to dial into something the size of a voxel. So a voxel, think pixel on your screen. A voxel is when it's 3-dimensional. So a little 5 millimeter cube of neurons, and how this voxel is talking to that voxel. And is it talking to that voxel kind of in the right language, in the right time, in the right amperage? So these kind of 3 metrics. And so when we're training somebody, we might be training 4, 5, 6, 700 metrics at one time that are distributed through the brain. So when we're training initially around depression, we were looking at the networks associated with depression, the what's called symptom checklist, or the affected areas that are, kind of evidence-based to appear in depression. So that's a completely different list of metrics than shows up on the TBI list, the traumatic brain injury list. So us switching the metrics that we were changing, what the computer was asking her brain to do at a very granular level, how her brain is moving energy and information from region to region, changing that and training her autonomics, just a complete game changer. She went from 30 sessions of very little positive change to maybe 10 sessions of a meaningful positive change that changed how she was at work, not only in her performance, but also her relationship with the people in the office, coming home at the end of the day, instead of just, crashing on the couch and doing nothing, actually having the motivation to join a gym, to call a friend to go out, to cook a meal.
Yeah.
We saw change across all of those domains. Again, her life opened up to her, and she could start to participate again. But it's worth saying, not only could, more importantly, wanted to.
Yeah.
Right? Like that intrinsic motivation to engage. And then that was met with also the ability. Like, but both sides were there. And that was simply by getting brain circuits reconnected.
Yeah. No, it's great.
Yep.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So, as you've listened to this, I think you're starting to see there's lots of ways to go about optimizing the brain. And I think if you're living with something and you've normalized it, but the more you think about it, it's like, geez, I'm not sure I really want it to be that way. I'm just telling you, we live in a day and age where these things can be deconstructed and understood, and your brain can be reprogrammed and retrained. There are many, many different techniques that overlap and interface with each other and complement each other in this regard. But working with someone that can at least open the door for you would be a first step to go forward in this. So, yeah, super cool stuff. Great.
I agree. Well, thank you again for making time to talk. It's always a delight. I learned so much.
Yeah, super fun. No, I really appreciate it too, guys. So thanks so much for sharing all your wisdom with us. So thanks.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Gladden Longevity Podcast. If you would like more information on what we've discussed or other topics, please reference the show notes or go to GladdenLongevityPodcast.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter by searching Gladden Longevity. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to get future episodes delivered to you and share our podcast or this episode with someone in your life that you may find benefit. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another exciting episode. The Gladden Longevity Podcast is provided for informational purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of a physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. The use of any information and materials linked to this podcast is at the listener's own risk.